And last but not least, I would like to introduce Dr. BRAUN. He is a lecturer in the Defense Studies Department at King's College London. Previously, he was senior lecturer in the Defense and International Affairs Department at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. The title of his presentation, Ukrainian Resources in Exchange for US Support, a Just War Perspective. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the kind invitation. It's a real honor to be here. And thank you to all of you for making it to this stage. So I know I'm the dead last, so I hope I can keep you entertained. So thanks for the kind invitation. I'm going to talk about a practical issue that I think is highly relevant with regards to the ethics of war, namely the minerals deal that has been struck between the US and Ukraine. And what I try to do is I try to assess the ethics of it. And I do that by applying just war theory, or at least like the gist of the just war tradition. So more than 3 years after Russia launched its full-scale invasion, the war in Ukraine remains central to the international security discussion. I don't need to talk about the relevance, like you can all read it in the newspapers, you can see the horrible pictures. So it's one of the most pressing concerns of our times. And NATO countries, especially the United States, have provided critical military aid while at the same time striving to avoid a direct involvement in hostilities. However, behind these efforts lies an interesting moral dilemma, I think. Can such support justifiably be tied to economic returns, particularly through access to a war-torn nation's natural resources? I think that's a highly complex question, and I'm not pretending I have all of the answers, and I can only encourage you to provide me with some feedback, because I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts about this. Now, if we look at this historically, from the outset, Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression has been widely recognized as a just war. And Father Yuri talked about this. I think there's a consensus that Ukraine is justifiably invoking its right to self-defense against Russian aggression. So in just war terminology, the war in Ukraine, on the side of Ukraine, meets the core jus ad bellum principles, so legitimate authority, just cause, and right intention. Many Western nations have been supporting Ukraine with military aid, first and foremost the United States, under the Biden administration. There has been much debate about whether the West, especially if you look at this early into the war, did enough to support Ukraine. But I think there can be no denial that the West has sent billions of dollars of military equipment to Ukraine to aid its war against Russia. Now, at the same time, there has also been a debate about ethical limits to that support. Leaders like former President Biden, and also if you think about former Chancellor Olaf Scholz, they were outspoken that due to the fear of escalation of the war in Ukraine to a global conflagration, there were certain limits to what should be done in terms of supporting Ukraine. And this argument, I think, continues to be present in the European debate. So we are still talking about should Germany send certain military equipment to Ukraine, or is that too escalatory? So I think that is still present in the debate. But if we look at the US specifically, the terms of debate have changed radically since the Biden administration got into power again. Without an end in sight to the war in Ukraine, reports emerged in 2024 and also earlier this year that the Trump administration was pressuring Ukraine to agree to resource concessions in exchange for the US's continued support. One leaked draft proposed that the US receive 50% of Ukraine's mineral and energy revenues until $500 billion in aid was, I quote, repaid. Such a proposal, I think, blurred the lines between support and leverage, prompting one Ukrainian analyst to remark, I quote, "It's as we lost the war to America. This looks like reparations." So there it is, like the question, like, can you make, or should it be ethically acceptable that the victim state repays the military aid it has been gifted? Now, that was just the proposal. So on April the 30th, 2025, so basically just about 2 months ago, the US and Ukraine actually signed a formal minerals agreement as part of a broader reconstruction investment framework. This deal gives the US preferential access to Ukraine's critical minerals like lithium, rare earths, and titanium in return for US investment in Ukraine's reconstruction. Notably, the final version includes joint ventures, Ukrainian ownership stakes, and transparency mechanisms. While it still reflects asymmetries in power, it is a marked improvement over earlier drafts. So it's not as coercive as what was initially reported. The deal also comes with the hope of indirect US security guarantees against future Russian aggression based on the assumption that the US would protect its investments in Ukraine. So basically, if Russia attacked some of those joint ventures, arguably the Trump administration would be more outspoken in support of Ukraine. So that's at least the hope of this deal. Still, I think looking at the ethics, it is really interesting to look at the more coercive initial plan, because that's where the crux of the matter lies. So if we look at the initial coercive plan and we look at the ethics, it's really interesting because the fact that coercive proposals were even entertained reflects a troubling shift in the ethics of international aid. So arguably we are moving from solidarity to some form of transactionalism. What began as a principled stand against illegal aggression has in some respects become an arena of economic negotiation. So it's just about making a deal in the Trump terminology. And such developments, I think, demand critical ethical reflection, and that's where the gist of the just war tradition as sort of the ethical framework that is underpinning Western thinking about the rights and wrongs of war can help us grapple with this issue. Now, the Catholic tradition of just war, which lies at the heart of my own research, starts from what has commonly been termed as a presumption against war. So only if a number of restrictive just war criteria have been met can the presumption against war be overruled. So the starting point is a presumption against war. And that's also, I think, where the mineral deal comes in again. So I'd like to quote from the Catechism here, because I think it's highlighting a really interesting point with regards to peace building. And the quote is paragraph 2317 of the Catechism, I quote, "Injustice, excessive economic or social inequalities, envy, distrust, and pride raging among men and nations constantly threaten peace and cause wars. Everything done to overcome these disorders contributes to building up peace and avoiding war," end of quote. Now, arguably, some of these vices, like envy, distrust, pride, undergirded the initial coercive plan for the minerals deal and thus contradict the ideal of building a just and lasting peace. And this brings me to the so-called jus post bellum, justice after war, the set of principles that are meant to facilitate a just peace after war. Traditionally, it concerns principles like post-war reconstruction, peace treaties, and accountability measures. Among its core aims are ensuring a stable peace, rebuilding institutions, and addressing the wrongs of war in a manner consistent with justice and not with vengeance. Now, reparations, going back to the minerals deal, are a key component, or can be a key component, of jus post bellum, and historically they have been seen as a form of compensation made by a wrongdoer to victims of aggression. Now, interestingly, if we apply this idea to the war against Ukraine, Ukraine is the aggrieved party, having suffered extensive destruction at the hand of Russian military aggression. While Russia bears direct responsibility for reparations, the current trajectory of the war makes reparations unlikely, in the short term at least. So this kind of creates a vacuum where alternative forms of restitution or rebuilding are considered, and that's where the minerals deal comes in. So, in a sense, one could perhaps argue that a coercive minerals deal would constitute a form of, or sort of a form of reparative justice by granting Ukraine access to global markets and investment for resource extraction. The US helps rebuild the Ukrainian economy and infrastructure. So arguably, from a jus post bellum perspective, this aligns with goals of economic recovery and future stability. However, this raises profound ethical tensions. First of all, it would let the aggressor off the hook, so to speak, and Ukraine would essentially have to pay its own reparations. From a just war perspective, reparations flow from aggressor to victim. What the initial, more far-reaching proposal would have meant, however, is a reversal. So the victim state is being asked to compensate its supporter. This risks transforming post-war justice into post-war exploitation. So in that sense, it is morally unjustifiable. It also threatens to erode moral clarity. If material gain becomes intertwined with moral obligation, then even just causes may become ethically ambiguous. If the deal overly benefits foreign, and in this case, mainly US investors, without ensuring that profits are reinvested into Ukrainian reconstruction, it risks becoming exploitative rather than restorative. And I think genuine jus post bellum principles require that agreements are equitable, transparent, and prioritize the well-being of the war-torn society. So you should not do something that makes the victim worse off. I think that's unjustifiable. So a coercive deal would come with a taste of resource extraction from weakened states, a historical pattern that contradicts modern understandings of post-war justice. For the minerals agreement to uphold jus post bellum, it must ensure that Ukraine retains sovereignty over its resources and benefits directly from their exploitation. If not, the deal would create an almost imperial-style exploitation regime that clearly seems morally wrong. So let me turn to the role of the US more specifically now. At the heart of the matter, I think, lies the Trump administration's approach to aiding Ukraine, which has shown a consistent preference for quid pro quo arrangements. In many ways, a transactional way of approaching the war. The administration's insistence that Ukraine pay for its weapons or offer strategic resources, such as critical minerals, in exchange for military support, distorts the moral imperative at hand. Ukraine is not a normal trading partner operating under conditions of stability and equality. It is a nation under siege, fighting not only for its sovereignty, but also for the democratic values that the West purports to uphold. Now, going back to the Catholic terminology, the US has a moral responsibility to support the global common good by helping Ukraine to defend itself against Russian aggression. However, by framing support as contingent on economic benefit, the US risks appearing more as a war profiteer than an ally. Such transactionalism undermines the moral high ground that the US claims to hold in its support for Ukraine, and this applies both to the specific support to Ukraine, but also the US as sort of a beacon of supporting the so-called rules-based international order. So it really risks undermining the US position here, because it sends a message to other democracies in peril. Assistance from the US is conditional now and ultimately self-serving. In doing so, it erodes global trust in American leadership and blurs the distinction between ethical obligation and economic opportunism. It may also encourage further aggression. So, think about the role of China and Taiwan. So it seems like it's almost like an opening of Pandora's box. So I really think we need to be careful here about what is at stake in Ukraine. Moreover, the idea that Ukraine should mortgage its future economic independence, particularly its control over mineral resources, while its survival is at stake, is ethically troubling. These resources will be crucial for Ukraine's post-war recovery and development. Pressuring a vulnerable nation to hand over long-term strategic assets during a moment of existential crisis seems ethically unjustifiable. The deal that was signed in late April is much better in this regard, but there's still an imbalance in the relationship between the US and Ukraine, I think. Now, while the concerns about coercion and post-war exploitation are valid, I think it's also really important to look at the position of Ukraine as the weaker side in this agreement and how much leeway the Ukrainian government actually has as it approaches the demands by the US. So, facing an existential threat from a military superior aggressor, Ukraine actually has limited options. Some may argue that agreeing to a minerals deal, even one with unfavorable terms, is a pragmatic necessity. And I think that's also what the just war tradition teaches us. So it's not, an ivory tower academic exercise. As I understand it, it is seeking to inform responsible statecraft. So in that sense, I think it's worth keeping in mind the delicate position that the Ukrainian government is in at the moment. So from this perspective, the agreement can be seen not as a betrayal of sovereignty, but as a strategic compromise, if you will, to ensure national survival. If the alternative is losing the war, resulting in, what we have seen in the areas where Russia is occupying Ukraine, mass displacement, massive violations of the laws of armed conflict, then a morally imperfect deal might actually be the lesser evil. And this, to my mind, is why thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, who has been mentioned several times today, emphasized the legitimate authority criterion of just war and the virtue of political prudence. Prudence as a cardinal virtue enables decision makers to act with wisdom, foresight, and humility in conditions of uncertainty and danger. Moreover, and that's my final point, in Catholic moral theology, the principle of double effect, also traced to Aquinas, allows for actions that have both good and bad consequences, provided certain conditions are met, namely that the negative consequences are not intended but only foreseen and are not disproportionate. So in other words, applying this to Ukraine, if entering into an imperfect minerals deal helps prevent the fall of Ukraine, then it may be acceptable, though still regrettable. Nevertheless, even if signing a coercive deal would have been the only realistic option for Ukraine, this does not absolve the international community and the Trump administration of its ethical responsibility. Allies should not exploit a partner's vulnerability. The moral burden falls not only on those making hard choices under pressure, but on those in a position to relieve that pressure and to act justly. Now, to conclude, doubtlessly, Ukraine's resistance to Russian aggression is morally justified, but the question is, what kind of peace will it receive at some point? If continued military support means selling mineral rights under duress, then we have hollowed out the ideals of justice and solidarity. If reparations flow from the victim to the helper, reverse the very logic of jus post bellum. In the end, peace must not only be achieved, it must be earned through justice, built upon dignity, and sustained by equity. Thank you very much.